Okay, so I am going to talk about violence in hunter-gatherer societies with the goal of thinking a little bit about origins of conspecific lethal violence in humans and what was going on in long periods of ancestral human societies that can ultimately give us insights into violence today, I suppose. I'm going to talk about two societies that I've been working with for the last 35, 40 years, 41 years in one case. These are both hunter-gatherers in South America, one up in Venezuela and the other down in Paraguay. And I want to try to also mention a few things that I think we can extract from the specific ethnographic examples that tell us that there are certain patterns of warfare in humans that are a little bit different even than Richard's obvious parallels to chimpanzees in some cases, the interest in numerical superiority and so on. And just foreshadowing, I'm going to come back to this, what's different about human warfare that can make us think about why I think levels of conspecific violent mortality in humans are going to be higher than any other primate, higher than any other mammal, and we need to understand why that would be true given what's going on in humans. But one example of things that humans do differently is they mark, they signal whether or not they have killed another individual, really common in lots of small-scale tribal societies, so that everybody who sees this individual, these are jaicha scars on an Ache man's back, telling me that this guy has killed at least one, and in some cases, depending on how many scars, I could know that he's killed multiple individuals. Humans signal this really effectively to people who've never been there, don't know them, didn't see it, and so on. And the signaling effect, the reputational effects, are really critical to understanding why levels of violence might be even higher in humans than they would be in a species that can't signal like this. So let's start with this. And by the way, this is a version of the talk I gave on CARTA online, that's online for CARTA a couple of years ago. I was forced to stick to a written script in that one, and this one I'm going to ad-lib, so hopefully I can keep to time. I started out like this by noting that the Washington Post called me up in January of 2012 and said, did you hear this story about a Machi gang of man who got killed by the uncontacted Mashkopiro? By the way, the Mashkopiro are huge in the news in the last month or so. There's still an uncontacted stone tool using group in Peru, and the Peruvian government, partially based on an essay that Rob Walker and I wrote in Nature earlier this summer, has decided to make contact with this uncontacted tribe. In any case, Chaco Flores was killed by the Mashkopiro in November, and I found that interesting because it tells us what happened is basically he had an accidental encounter with the Mashkopiro group, and they shot him on sight and put a bamboo-tipped arrow right through his heart. And the Mashkopiro are one of the very last completely uncontacted, isolated groups in the world. They still use stone tools. The fact that they kill outsiders on sight is pretty interesting and may tell us something about ancestral violence. But what really struck my attention is that Chaco was my guide 20 years earlier. He and I spent an entire year tracking the Mashkopiro through the forest in 1983. We came within 25 meters of a Mashkopiro camp and sat in the jungle underbrush listening to the people talking and the children playing and everything. And we debated amongst ourselves. At that time, there were 3 other guides with me, whether or not we should attempt a contact with this group. And we all decided to back off and not make that contact, probably wisely because, 20 years later, Chaco ends up being killed by these people. There's also another uncontacted tribe very close by in the Manu region of Peru and the border region of Brazil. These are the Yoranawa, and they also shoot at outsiders on sight, and they're in the news a lot now too. You can Google either one of these groups and see all kinds of great telephoto lens pictures out of helicopters and so on, of them shooting arrows at people flying overhead and so on. very, very recent stuff. They also kill outsiders at sight, and there's a lot of known history about what happened going back in the 80s. And ironically, I also worked with this group back in the 80s. And I spent time, I made first contact with Hilly Kaplan with the Headwaters group and listened to their tales of how they had massacred 25 Shell oil workers a month before we got to their village and so on. But what's really ironic and ties all this together is that Shaka was my guide when we contacted these people, and he casually told me one evening how they had slaughtered his entire family and his entire village when he was 10 years old. The Yoranawa had attacked his Matsigenga village, exterminated every man, woman, and child, tortured some of them, put his little sister with a stake through her body, running through her anus and out her mouth in the middle of the village, and Shako escaped by jumping into the river and going underwater and floating downstream as they were shooting arrows at him. So he was the only survivor. So what, putting together these anecdotes, can we go beyond anecdotes and start extracting some information about what happens in remote societies with no state-level interference in conflict? And I think that first I'm going to talk about casual inspection. I'm going to give a lot of anecdotal ethnographic information. I think that actually the details of the killing is really critical to understanding the functional significance of what the killing is about. And as you'll see when I wrap this up, this is going to bring us back to questions about why do humans kill and whether or not it's slightly different than what's going on in chimpanzees. People often kill out-group members on sight. I think this is really well established. Rates of death are often significant even to attackers, something that I think is different than what Richard Wrangham was suggesting. I've got lots of anecdotes on that. Victims of violent death come from all age and sex categories, in family, in band, between tribes, and we're going to look at all of this. It's not all the same thing. And it's probably obvious, certainly to anybody who's an evolutionary biologist, that all types of killings may not represent the same adaptive functional behavior. Killers and defenders may act alone, in small kin groups, or in larger coalitions. This is true even for hunter-gatherers. Potential benefits and costs of killing, as I said, suggest to me more than one adaptive function. And we want to be careful not to confuse these. And I think that you actually have to consider all the forms of killing. The payoffs in benefits and costs to all the forms of killing can inform us on why high-risk warfare takes place in humans and not in chimpanzees. So let's see if I can cover some of that. I've done a lot of field research. I think about half of the crowd knows me here in one way or another. A lot of field research over the last 42 years of my life with remote populations, mainly in Amazonia. I've recently been working in Africa and then in the Philippines for the last 4 years, but today I'm mainly going to talk about Amazonia. And one of the critical things here that's maybe a little bit more rare in anthropology is collecting systematic demographic information under the rubric of life history studies on all births and deaths of a really large sample of people, all close relatives, grandparents, siblings, parents, siblings, own siblings, offspring, own offspring, grand offspring, et cetera, which gives an unbiased sample. And there's actually a lot of biased samples in small-scale anthropological demography. I'm not going to go into that, but I think what I'm going to give you today is an unbiased sample. If you could just take a slice of time in a tribe and look at everything that's happening to everybody, and we're going to pull out some numbers. So in the process of interviewing the Hiwi in Venezuela and the Ache in Paraguay, we recorded about 400 violent deaths, and all of this is published. All right, but before I go to the statistics, which is useful in some ways, I actually think that the ethnographic details are really important and relevant. And now let me see how I'm doing for time, because I'm going to go through this faster than I did in my last version of this talk because I want to get to the end, the summary, the big points of what I think are different about human killing. So I'm not going to actually talk about every single case, but let's look at these in what I call different functional classes of conspecific violent death. First one I'm going to call infanticide, killing of individuals under 2 years old. That's an arbitrary age cutoff by parents and others. And this is the only case where I find women involved. So of the 400 deaths that I'm going to be talking about today, the only ones that were ever committed by females were this, and only in the case of females killing their own infant. But nevertheless, most of the infanticide in both of these groups was actually committed by males, and sometimes the father of the child, often not the father of the child. And we could talk at length about what's going on there and whether you should separate those two into different functional questions as well. Second class of, did I say that this made up, just keep track of this. So 93 of the deaths in that sample came into this category. These are conspecific violent deaths. 45 of the deaths were what I call child homicide. This is really interesting, and I think you need to really think about what's going on here because I think it's relevant to later understanding adult-on-adult homicide. So let me just give one example here. And by the way, I have removed the actual names of these people if they're still alive, but I use their name if they're dead. And these are the real pictures of the real killers. It's not the real pictures of the victims. It's somebody who's the same age and sex that I just kind of put in there too. So D and A here, who are both still alive, killed this girl Kanjegi back in 1962. She was 12 years old. Child homicide is a pretty large child to be. Most of the child homicides are more on kids like 5, 6, 7, 3, whatever. Because her father, Betchapegi, had just been killed in a club fight, and they decided to sacrifice her alive and send her to the grave with her father. And also, by the way, nobody wanted to take care of her and raise her, and she was an orphan. There were a couple cases that we saw. I was actually present when the Ache attempted to throw this girl Wapugi into the grave alive when her mother died because she was orphaned, and she was immediately saved by a missionary who was present at the time. But in the forest period, this child homicide would have taken place. Then we've got geronticide. You could call this euthanasia if you want. 10 cases, pretty classic stuff that you've probably all heard about in myths and whatever. So this guy here that I interviewed, Piragi, told me how he had killed 3 different women in the 1960s by hitting them over the head with an axe when they were looking the other way, and in every case it was because they had become old and decrepit and a burden to the band, you know, however you want to phrase that. And we had some cases. Quardegi here told me how he buried his own mother alive. And in this interview, when he was actually going to the details of burying his own mother alive, it's one of the few times I've seen the men break down in tears crying. Hunter-gatherer males are pretty macho in general, and they don't usually go to the point of crying in front of an anthropologist. But so obviously this was a very emotional event. He told me that his mom was too sick. She couldn't keep up with the band, and that the alternative, if they left her behind, is that she would be eaten alive by vultures who would peck out her eyes while she was still alive, and so he decided it would be better to bury her. Mercy killing, whatever you want to call it. Then we've got suicide. That's right, yes. Despite all of the romantic mythologies about hunter-gatherer lives, this is going to probably tell us something about humans, real humans, that yeah, even in hunter-gatherers there's depression to the point that we've got several cases of people committing suicide. This particular case was pretty fascinating to me. I'll skip these other two. This guy's son told me how his father committed suicide when he got old and sick, and he was worried that he had become a burden on his family. The father painted himself up one day, took all of his weapons, and walked directly into an enemy camp and was never seen again. It's an interesting combination of suicide and something about warfare. Then we've got spousal homicide. 5 cases of, in every case, a man killing his wife. Is spousal homicide telling us anything about warfare? I actually think it is, and so that's why I'm putting all these things up, because we want to get to a more general theory of when humans would resort to killing another human in terms of what might be the ultimate explanations, the costs and benefits, and the evolutionary explanations of that. So there are cases. Seems like a really bizarre and stupid thing to do in a pair-bonded species, to kill your pair-bonded mate, because not only might they continue to reproduce with you, but in any case, in every one of these cases, the wife who was killed was the main caretaker of offspring that belonged to the husband who's the killer, which seems like, you know, that's really stupid to be killing mom who's taking care of my own offspring. And yet it happens. Not a really high frequency, but it happens. And then we have classic homicide. So these cases are all men killing men. This is my favorite, actually my best friend among the Hiwi confided in me once he could trust me that I wasn't going to turn him into the police, that he had killed a guy. He came to me one evening and said, I killed a guy last night and I don't want you to tell the police about it. And he cut him up in little pieces and threw him in the river because he caught the guy flirting with his wife. And then we have ritual. These are actual planned and refereed ritual combat leading to death. 9 deaths. Intra-tribal warfare. So this is band against band in the same ethno-linguistic group. And I couldn't resist putting this in here that, yes, there was terrorism, there was torture and mutilation following some of these deaths. And then finally, and one of the things that's interesting about the raiding that, again, is a human characteristic is they spend a lot of time practicing for this. I don't know if chimpanzees practice their raids, but humans definitely practice. And they also do a lot of things that I would call solidarity, emotional bonding, to work themselves into a commitment frenzy before they go off on one of these coalitionary raids. And I think this is going to get to the proximate mechanisms of part of what helps this kind of proactive. And then finally, intertribal. This is what we might call true warfare, going after people who belong to a different ethno-linguistic group. A lot of deaths. So the big picture, I'm going to skip this one and jump maybe to this one. Here is that we know all the deaths from violence, and we know the risk population. We know exactly how many person years. We've got some pre-contact and some post-contact calculations. And here's violent death rates per 100,000 people in the pre-contact period. So there's some real hard numbers you can use to compare to stuff. What might you want to compare it to? Here's the numbers for the US in the 20th century. Here's my Hiwi numbers before and after contact, Ache numbers before and after contact, and also I put up a calculation for the Kung. I think maybe Polly's going to have some numbers there. You can see way higher, an order of magnitude higher in hunter-gatherer societies than in the US in the 20th century. I'm going to skip this one here where I talk about basically that I think Steve Pinker is right, that modern institutions have greatly reduced mortality and warfare compared to what was going on in ancestral periods. And how many minutes am I at now? I'm going to skip actually dividing this up into infanticide, homicide, geronticide, suicide, and so on, spousal homicide, and get straight to the big, the upshot. Are there some unique patterns of violent mortality, and what does this tell us? And I think there are, and if I get to all of them, great, but I want to get to number 1 no matter what, because I think this is the single most important one. Human hunter-gatherers act as cooperative breeders. The socio-reproductive system relies, I think, obligatorily on helpers at the nest, and extensive provisioning, kin investment, and so on. And this means that we can make sense out of a lot of what goes on by actually looking at other cooperative breeders, and my favorite model is actually social insects, which are extreme versions of cooperative breeders, but seem to do things that humans do, like infanticide, child homicide, geronticide, and suicide. Ants do all of those things. And I don't think there's any other mammal that does all of those things. Humans have committed helpers at the nest, sometimes obligate helpers at the nest for life. And humans have berserkers. Everybody know what a berserker is? A guy who goes out on the battlefield suicidally, willing to risk his life. Ants have berserkers as well. I don't think any other mammals do. Spousal homicide is really interesting. In a pair-bonded mating system, it brings up a lot of questions about what's going on. Regulated within group, regulated combat that leads to death is something that's really interesting that we need to think about. The importance of signaling opportunities, where I started off on the first slide, and reputation as a motivator leading to much higher levels of violence than you could get in a species that's unable to signal and come up with reputation. Pre-emptive killing, I think, I don't have time to discuss this, but I think this is going to explain why kill on sight is so common in most of human ancestral history, because it's a risk-averse strategy. If you don't know what the other people are doing, even if there's a 1% chance that they intend to kill you rather than peacefully trade with you, the safe bet is to go ahead and kill them first. And if both parties are thinking the same thing, you're going to get really high levels of violence, even though friendly interaction and trade might actually be better for everybody. An awful lot of the stories suggest that the resource that's being contested in many cases is not territory, but females. In this case, I think there are strong parallels to chimpanzees. And then, of course, this issue that the modelers have been really obsessed with, which is that you're providing a public good, there's a temptation to free ride. How does this really work? How can you get people out risking their lives on the battlefield? Can I just have 30 seconds to say, while I think this is a really important mathematical problem to be modeled, and a lot of you guys here are doing this, I think you're missing out on another opportunity, which is, in my opinion, there is no theory whatsoever that can predict the following decision problem. You're here, your neighbors are there, they have good stuff, you want it. There's two things you can do. You can either go take it by force and kill them, or you can go make friends with them and negotiate a deal and hopefully bring Donald Trump along with you because he's a really great negotiator. So you'd think that you'd see sometimes neighboring groups would get into friendly relations and negotiate deals, and sometimes they would say, okay, we're going to take it by force. We know that both happens. It's not the case that all ancestral societies are violent. It's not the case that they're always peaceful. We have no good mathematical model to predict when A is going to be the option and when B is going to be the option. And I think that solving that is really going to get us much closer to understanding levels of warfare. Because levels of warfare in small-scale societies are about, do you decide to attack and kill, or do you decide to have peaceful interaction? So I'll end there.